In mid-2015, Rosie Batty stood up to give a speech.
Would you please make her very welcome, the Australian of the Year, Rosie Batty. Thank you.
She was campaigning to end domestic violence. A year and a half earlier, her 14-year-old son Luke had been murdered by his father. She was calling for family violence to be taken as seriously as terrorism.
You know, let's start calling it family terrorism, and perhaps we start to see that investment of funding being applied where it needs to be.
At the time, many commentators were slightly sceptical.
I sort of am reluctant to get into some kind of misery competition about which is worse than the other.
I don't want to see some sort of kind of hierarchy of misery.
This speech was given just 6 months after the Lint Cafe siege in Sydney.
A city is under siege and a nation in shock.
The perpetrator, I might add, was awaiting trial for dozens of sexual assault charges and orchestrating the murder of his ex-wife. Nearly a decade later, despite a clear link between terrorism and family violence, we treat them as separate things. When someone kills women because they're women, we don't look at that murder as being driven by an ideology.
There's no ideological motivation. We do understand that there is a history of mental health.
I think that I have a pretty good handle on the history and causes of terrorism, and I thought that I had a good understanding on the history and causes of domestic violence. It turns out, on that second thing, I was wrong. Today, should we treat domestic violence like we treat terrorism? I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening. The first thing that domestic violence and terrorism have in common is that people didn't really start to think about them all that much until the 1970s. In the case of terrorism, it was due to a sudden spike in bombings and hijackings. In the case of domestic violence, it was due to a break-in. In early 1974, women's rights activist Anne Summers was wandering the streets of the Sydney suburb of Glebe, looking for somewhere to open Australia's first women's refuge.
And there were a pair of little cottages that appeared to be in perfect condition. One of them had a woman's name, Elsie, which seemed to be perfect.
The houses were owned by the Anglican Church, but were abandoned. Thanks to Australia's proud history of people taking control of land that doesn't belong to them, there are certain legal protections for squatters.
If you were able to change the lock and establish residency, you then had squatters' rights, and the landlord would have to take you to court to evict you.
They decided that this would be the place.
I was sort of terrified when we marched around the corner that we'd run into this huge mob of policemen, and there'd be paddy wagons and stuff all lined up ready to cart us away, but no, there wasn't.
They broke in the door and went inside.
I think everybody was very euphoric.
It took a bit of work to clean the place up, but before long they were ready to open. They painted Women's Refuge on the front wall, named the refuge Elsie, and opened the doors.
We publicised the address far and wide, and we sat there waiting.
The women's liberation movement squatted in these two derelict houses owned by the Church of England.
They waited and waited.
And we sat there for 3 days and 3 nights and thought, well, nobody's turned up. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe we don't need this.
In reality, there was no way to know how serious the problem of domestic violence was in Australia. It wasn't taken very seriously by police and the justice system. For women with violent husbands, they could go to the police or they could flee. But then what? Where would they live? It was particularly difficult for mothers. How could a woman earn money for rent and food when she also had to look after the children?
I can't get a job because I've got nowhere to put the kids. I've got nowhere to put the kids because I haven't any money. I haven't got anywhere to live because I've got no money. I've got no money because I can't get a job.
This was the idea behind Elsie. But for 3 days, nobody came. Then, on the 4th day,
a Scottish woman turned up. Her husband used to beat her constantly, and she was just absolutely beside herself to find out there was somewhere she could come.
Well, now you're here, come in, have a cup of tea.
Word about Elsie started spreading.
I used to have a battery radio, and I was listening to it in the kitchen, washing up the breakfast dishes after they'd all gone to school. And they started talking about this wonderful place, Elsie.
6 weeks later, when the ABC arrived to find out what was going on, 48 women and 36 children had arrived at Elsie's doorstep. The women inside told the ABC reporter horrific stories.
I've had broken nose, broken jaw. He pushed me down the steps. Well, I lost the baby. I had a miscarriage.
How old are you?
44. I had 10 children.
Do you think if you really agonised about it, that some of the blame might be yours?
Oh, I don't know. I've often asked myself that question, but I can't see that I could have done any better.
The ABC also interviewed some men. They said women always carried at least some, if not all, of the blame.
I would have very much liked to know what the husband had to say. It's so characteristic of a certain type of woman. She nags, she runs her husband into debt.
That makes my skin crawl, to be honest with you.
I would say that no matter where you find trouble and calamity, somewhere you'll find a woman behind it.
Just a reminder that this man, an Australian professional accountant, felt comfortable sharing this opinion on national television only 50 years ago. Sociologists around the world started trying to find a root cause of domestic violence. Early on, they made a strange discovery. It was almost like abusers were following a kind of script, or were all getting together somewhere secretly to discuss tactics. My former colleague Jess Hill wrote extensively about this in her book, See What You Made Me Do. She says researchers found that abusive men seem to be unconsciously following a similar set of tactics to those used by North Korean torturers during the Korean War. Tactics that were also used by cult leaders, sex traffickers, and hostage takers. It wasn't just abuse, it was a process of thought reform and entrapment. The tactics start with isolation.
I never went out. I never entertained. I couldn't, because the simple reason is if I had friends in, he came in, he'd order them out.
Making everything seem like it's the victim's fault.
I would say to her, well, you made me do it, you know. You know that if you keep doing this to me, that I'm going to get bloody angry. And why do you do it?
Degrade the victim as much as possible until they believe it really is their fault.
You're incompetent, stupid, insane. I'll have you committed. You're a hopeless mother. You can't cook. You're fat, ugly.
Degradation is a big part of it. Insulting their appearance, their intelligence, and implying that they're insane.
He kept telling me I was going crazy, and I felt that I was going crazy, you know.
Make the victim so exhausted by fear that they just give in to your demands.
I learned to switch myself off.
In many abusive relationships, the violence is only sporadic, but the threat is always there. Or the threat of even worse violence against their wife, their children, their pets, their home, or themselves.
I threatened her with an axe. I destroyed everything in this room, and I intended to destroy her and this house and everything goes with it. Which I would have, as God as I know my own judge.
This is obviously where the comparisons to terrorism become easiest to make. Abusers do something horrific, hoping to change other people's behaviour through terror. The fact that the pattern of behaviour was so easily identifiable gave hope to the idea that maybe some common cause could be found for domestic abuse, and the problem could be addressed at its root. So people started to try to figure out what was the difference between men who beat their partners and men who did not.
Why do you think he knocked you around?
Well, I've often asked myself that question. I don't know.
Pretty early on, two prevailing theories about what was going on emerged. One theory was that abusers are mentally ill. They suffer from sociopathy, or they've been traumatised by their childhood.
Well, it's likely to occur in people who've had a lot of frustration in their childhood, or people who've witnessed violence when they were children. It becomes part of their nature.
The other theory is that society itself is broken. Men are brought up with a sense of entitlement, to be a real man, to be an emotionless, empowered master of his domain.
They believe that if I do this, then that should automatically happen. And that's very frustrating when you find out life doesn't work like that.
When they make that realisation, they strike out against their spouses in an insecure rage.
It's just that she was much more cleverer in speaking than I was. And I felt inadequate in that way, and that was the defence mechanism that I had to stay on top, I guess.
Ideas were put forward for how to deal with the problem. But in the meantime, women needed help urgently. The women running the Elsie Women's Refuge knew they needed help to scale up their service, and they decided that they would go out and get it. One of the women saw the Federal Minister of Health getting into a car after an event in Sydney and just jumped into the car with him to ask him to come and visit Elsie. Another woman managed to grab hold of the Federal Social Services Minister Bill Hayden at a conference and give him an invitation. 2 weeks later, there was a man at the door.
It wasn't me that answered the door, thank heavens, but some woman answered the door and said, "Sorry, you're not allowed in here, go away, men aren't allowed."
She opened the door and told us to shoot through and slammed the door on us.
The man at the door was Bill Hayden. He tried to explain who he was, but it didn't work.
We knocked a few more times, nothing happened, so we stood around the footpath perplexed because we were there on invitation.
They started to wander off.
And then when we realised what had happened, we'd had to run down the path and grab Bill Hayden and say, "It's all right, Bill, come in, we'll talk to you."
Hayden had a lifelong interest in helping victims of domestic violence. He'd grown up with a violent father and become a police officer and then social services minister. What he saw inside Elsie disturbed him. Not only the stories of the women staying there, but the conditions that they were staying in.
I was impressed by what they were trying to do, but I was disturbed by the struggle they were having to try to provide these services.
The place was cramped, unpleasant, and already at capacity. They were being forced to turn women away.
I told the people with me that they better work out ways to get a bit of money to them.
Elsie was given a one-off payment equivalent to $500,000 in today's money to move to a better location around the corner. Then 9 more women's refuges were opened around the country, and they received funding from Hayden's department as well. By the end of the 1970s, there were dozens of refuges around the country, but they were constantly needing to lobby for more funding. That was 50 years ago now, and women's shelters are still underfunded.
Staff say they're still forced to turn 5 or 6 women away every week.
Women's shelters are vital for women and kids who literally need to go into hiding, but they aren't a solution. They are a treatment for a symptom, not a treatment for the cause. And after 50 years of research, we still haven't identified a simple explanation for why domestic violence exists. Some men who are healthy are violent or controlling towards their partners. Some men who would consider themselves to be feminists also are violent or controlling towards their partners. Conversely, millions of men who do have mental health problems and or misogynistic views would never dream of hurting their partner. Countries with great mental health services and high levels of gender equality still have a serious domestic violence problem. The simple common denominator that causes some men to do this horrific thing doesn't seem to exist. Changing bail laws or putting age verification limits on pornography or closing the gender pay gap or saying real men don't hit women or giving harsh punishments to abusers won't entirely deal with the problem. Just like improving airport security, locking cockpit doors, killing terrorist leaders, toppling governments, increasing or decreasing the number of guns in society won't entirely deal with terrorism. The causes of terrorism are just as diverse and complex. The solution to both problems is a lot of policy change across a lot of different areas, all at a great cost. Australia has spent literally tens of billions of dollars protecting its citizens from terrorism in the last few decades. The US has spent trillions. In this week's federal budget, $466 million was allocated to women's safety measures. That's about a fifth of what the government is spending on counter-terrorism and national security agencies. Keep in mind, in the last 30 years, more than 1,500 women have been killed by their intimate partners in Australia. 9 people have been killed by terrorists. Everyone agrees that this is a crisis, but apparently can't agree on how much we are willing to spend to end it.